Good morning from Swissnex San Francisco at Pier 17. I'm Mary Ellen Johnson, the head of exhibitions at Swissnex, where we connect Switzerland to the western half of the US in art, science, innovation, and education. I want to say a few words about today's event before I get started. The event will be recorded, and we encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can add questions at any point during the discussion, and mostly we'll address them at the end of the event. Over the years at Swissnex, we've experimented with different forms and manifestations of art and science collaborations. And a couple of those were with San Francisco artist Jonathon Keats. Today, we'll hear about his latest project, Rivertime, which is a civic initiative intended to bolster public appreciation of river systems and teach them about rivers as climate indicators by using them as timekeepers. We will also hear from two specialists working and researching in the art science field. Bianca Viena Baptista, who is conducting transdisciplinary research at ETH Zurich and specifically working with Jonathon on the Rivertime project in Switzerland. And Stephanie Vasco, who is an artist and formerly trained as a scientist and based at the Center for Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State. They will speak to the importance of collaborative and interdisciplinary research and how that can teach us new ways of finding solutions in these times where we're faced with a global crisis in planetary health. Together, our speakers will give us a taste of what an interdisciplinary project like Rivertime can teach us and how it can enrich our lives and our futures. But first, let's hear about Alaska Rivertime from Jonathon and from Julie Decker, the director and CEO of the Anchorage Museum in Alaska. The Anchorage Museum first brought this project to fruition at the museum, at the Alaska Museum. This museum is a leading center for scholarship, engagement, and investigation of Alaska and the North. Julie Decker's career has been focused on the people and environment of Northern places and building projects and initiatives that are in service to local and global communities. Before becoming the director and CEO, Decker served as the museum's chief curator. She has a doctorate in art history and a master's degree in arts administration. She's curated and designed numerous exhibitions, taught classes, and authored and edited numerous publications on subjects related to contemporary art and architecture of the North, and aspects of the Arctic environment and histories. Jonathon Keats is an artist, writer, and experimental philosopher based in San Francisco. His conceptually driven interdisciplinary projects explore all aspects of society through science, technology, and culture. He has exhibited and lectured at dozens of institutions worldwide and is the author of 6 books on subjects ranging from science and technology to art and design. Most recently, You Belong to the Universe, Buckminster Fuller and the Future, published by Oxford University Press. He is currently a polar lab artist at the Anchorage Museum and an artist in residence at the SETI Institute, UC San Francisco's Memory and Aging Center, and the UC Berkeley's Saugeen Creek Field Station. A monograph about his art is forthcoming. Now I hand the screen over to Jonathon and Julie. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll say good morning from Alaska to everyone. Jonathon and I first met years ago at an art and environment conference because we both talked about Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller, as everyone knows, was concerned about the future of our environment and was looking for solutions. And here we are decades later, facing one of the greatest global experiments we could imagine. So Jonathon and I started having conversations about nature as timekeeper and how Alaska might be one of those clocks to consider the climate crisis and how humans might, how we might affect that experiment if we could know all of the data. So in Alaska right now, according to River Time, it is January 3rd, 2021. So Happy New Year. And I want to start by asking Jonathon about nature as a timekeeper and why rivers. In Alaska, we're experiencing climate change at twice the rate of the rest of the globe. It affects Indigenous communities first. In November last year, we had an entire community on the western coast of Alaska relocate due to coastal erosion as a result of climate change. So for us, the clock is ticking. So Jonathon, can you talk a little bit about river time?
Yes, well, delighted to be here with Julie, though we are, of course, in different cities, as seems to be the way of life on Zoom. But I have been for quite a while trying to figure out how we can counteract some of the effects of what you might generally refer to as technical time, which is to say the way in which time has become industrialized along with everything else in our world ever since the Industrial Revolution, the railroads, and various other mechanisms, all of which depended on time being coordinated. Basically, time becoming an abstraction that could be used as a way in which to ensure that railroads didn't collide with one another, and ultimately that multinational corporations could act with impunity without really noticing even what effect their decisions were having on the planet. So in looking forward, I guess that I looked back in a way, looked back to ways in which time has been reckoned long before we had the atomic clock or even had the mechanical clock. These natural systems all around us that are in time and that are indicative of time. And in Alaska, this is still very much alive as a way of as a way of being for many Inuit peoples. So it really became for me a perfect place as I started with Julie to explore some of the natural phenomena in Alaska, a perfect place to instantiate the idea of looking to time indication from natural systems. And in particular, we started out on the glaciers, and we visited Matanuska, which was quite extraordinary, and ultimately also looked at some of the rivers. And of course, for me at least, a cliche is always indicative of something ultimately profound, because I think that cliches only come about as a result of the fact that they capture some sort of deeper wisdom and they become a shorthand for it. So we talk about time flowing and we talk about rivers as well as, again, this idea of flow that can, I, I believe at least, become the basis for reckoning time in the world. That is to say that we can look at the flow of rivers in order to be able to see the flow of time, where the flow of rivers is irregular and therefore where we need to be in the moment. So there's a level of contingency involved, and also where rivers are over time potentially changing in terms of their rate of flow as a result of climate change, and therefore rivers can show how the world is changing as a result of us and of our activity on the planet. So river time in Alaska really started from conversations that Julia and I had around some of the issues of technical time and around questions of how we could, as a society, start to think about time in other ways, and what sorts of calibrations could be used and what sorts of public means could be used to bring those ideas and bring time itself in these alternate forms out into the world.
And Jonathon, I think the idea of a glacier-fed river is key to Alaska and understanding the difference in how the rivers flow between a river that may have another kind of source. So can you talk about the rivers as indicators? And maybe we could look at the alaskarivertime.org website quickly. You can see how we're using 5 different rivers as the timekeepers and developing a mean time.
Well, Alaska, of course, has glaciers, many of them. They're extraordinary, and they are melting. Glaciers always do, but they should, in order for them to survive over the long term, they should not be melting more than they are freezing. And so glaciers become really interesting in perhaps not a very happy way, but nevertheless in a way that is real and that is important for us to consider, in terms of the fact that their flow can they're melting as it gets to a stage where they are melting more than they are freezing, leads to phenomena that can be measured by way of rivers. And one of these that is most pertinent perhaps is something that is called peak flow. Effectively, that as the climate warms, rivers will flow more rapidly for a period of time and then start to flow more and more slowly. So Alaska as a place where there are many rivers that are fed by different glaciers becomes a place where it is possible, by measurement of those rivers and by looking at that measurement as a measurement of time, becomes a place in which one can see global phenomena, specifically phenomena related to climate change, but also can see these phenomena in very localized terms, the terms of each individual glacier. In Alaska, there also are many rivers that are spring fed, and that therefore, in the case of these rivers, other phenomena are in play, all of which once again are environmental, ecological, in terms of what is indicated by observing their flow. So by taking 5 rivers, 3 of them glacially fed, 2 of them spring fed, and averaging their flow in the creation of what we refer to as Alaska mean river time, it becomes a means by which, in a place that is highly sensitive to environmental change, to make observations of change over time or not, and to do so in a way that potentially engages everybody in terms of their lives, in terms that are immediately comprehensible, because we tend to think about our world and our lives in minutes and hours, as opposed to in terms of phenomena such as peak flow, or in terms of cubic meters per hour, or various other scientific measures. So by making this into something that we can all reckon with, it allows us to understand and appreciate change, but it also potentially calibrates us in terms of our activity. And what can happen potentially is that time can become the basis for feedback mechanisms, where the time that is kept by the river, speeding up or slowing down, can calibrate the rate at which we go about our lives. So what we've been trying to do in Alaska, in a place where people already are very much aware of their rivers, and therefore where it is not as much of a challenge as it might be in other places, just to get people to the point of being interested in their rivers to begin with, is to get people to encourage people to delve more deeply into what their rivers are doing, in order then to be able to calibrate how they operate, how they live in the world. And that means having a greater awareness in the moment of change, and therefore being more present in the world, in the environment, and also thinking over the long term of about aggregate change over time and the consequences of action, individual and collective, over the long term.
Thanks. I think one of the things that's interesting about your work is that you call many of your projects thought experiments. Some of them play with the scientific method, but ultimately they're posing big questions of all of us. And also offering an opportunity, I think, and an opportunity to affect the final outcome of that experiment. So can you talk about your provocations in your work, what it means to have a thought experiment, and how we might all think about affecting the outcomes of this experiment as we recalibrate our connections with nature?
I studied philosophy and ultimately escaped because it seemed to me that philosophy, as taught in academia, has a lot of rigor, but also is quite remote from people, from society, and therefore from the sort of action that can have in the world. And when I abandoned philosophy, I smuggled as much as I could with me. And one of the instruments that I took was the thought experiment, which is typically a mode of experimentation that is, or rather a mode of argumentation that is used to try to persuade people of your point of view, of your position, by positing an alternate reality and leading people into that as a way in which to see that is fundamentally going to lead them to a contradiction that then leads them back to the position that you had at the outset that you wanted to persuade them of. When I took the thought experiment out of the academic realm, I thought of it as being something that could genuinely be an experiment, that I could set up a counterfactual or set up an alternate reality out in the world and invite others into it, where we could collectively explore, without any foregone conclusion, explore what the implications might be. But I think that what I have discovered over time as I've done this, and as I've found that people can be brought into deep philosophical thought quite easily, actually, and quite willingly, is that it was also an opportunity for us to collectively reach some sort of, I wouldn't say a conclusion, but some sort of call to action that, based on what we collectively observe, we could come to some sort of collective decision about what the world in fact needs. And if the thought experiments were to be about the world in which we live, this could become an organizing factor or a means by which to, instead of telling people what to do, and I don't really know what to do, and that's why I undertake thought experiments to begin with, but once we figure out what to do, to go about doing it. And really, there's very little in our world. There's nothing in our world that's more important than, and there are very few things that are as important as contending with an environment where the climate is changing rapidly and detrimentally to all life. So to take the thought experiment and to deploy it in Alaska, a place that is ideal for the sorts of questions that I'm trying to ask, a place where the environment is so rapidly and visibly changing, and to use that as a laboratory where people not only from Alaska, but from elsewhere can come together in order to be able to explore the world and its change, it potentially can become quite powerful. And it become more powerful as it becomes part of a network, in the same way that we take several rivers in Alaska and network them to come up with mean time. We're now looking to Switzerland, which is how we come to be at Swissnex, and at rivers in Switzerland, which then can become their own network, and then ultimately a network of networks, such that ultimately you have highly localized observation of local systems by people living in one place or another, but all aggregating into a global system, which also becomes many local conversations aggregating into a global conversation. And because I think that these conversations can lead to action, because the thought experiment involves us, not only as the experimenters, but also that we are experimented upon, it can lead us in a way that is not what you would necessarily want in a physics lab, where you don't want people getting their fingers in front of the lenses. But in the case of the world, where we really do need to act, it can become an impetus for action that perhaps we can contend with a catastrophe that we are currently facing.
Thank you. Mary Ellen, I think we're moving on to other speakers.
Great, thank you so much, Julie and Jonathan. There's so many questions that come to mind for me just listening to you talk. For example, I'm curious about how what your audience response was to the programs you did in Alaska. We also have another question in our Q&A, but I think we'll address those after we hear from our next speakers. A reminder to our audience, please do just insert your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to those quickly. So next we'll hear from our interdisciplinary specialists, Bianca Viana-Baptista and Stephanie Vasco. They both work in inter and transdisciplinary research where they strive to better connect the arts and humanities to collaborative settings and in approaching societal changes. Today, as we're faced with seemingly insurmountable crises such as climate change, we're looking for new ways to address these problems and questions. Through interdisciplinarity and by including arts and humanities into the scientific problem, solving equations can better address these challenges, perhaps. How can the arts and sciences, arts and humanities be activated by scientific questions? These are some of the issues that they're thinking of and working around. A few words about our speakers. Bianca Viana-Baptista. She received her PhD in cultural studies at the University of Granada in Spain. And she's a postdoctoral researcher at the Transdisciplinary Lab at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. As a researcher and lecturer, she works in the broad field of science, technology, and society studies, focusing in particular on the study of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary knowledge production processes. As a result, she's interested in methods and tools, as well as concepts and theories as a means of achieving transformative and developmental change to solve multidisciplinary social problems. Bianca has taught and researched at multiple universities where she's received many international awards. She has co-edited and authored several books and papers on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. Stephanie Vasco, who will speak after Bianca, is the managing director for the Center of Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State University. She holds a PhD in chemistry and nanotechnology. Her research focuses on enhancing communication and collaboration for teams, especially interdisciplinary teams, with the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative and via using new technologies such as machine learning, as well as on using new technologies such as creative tools. Vasco is a practicing artist, taking her inspiration from nature and in creating transformative and immersive experiences that evoke a sense of place, blending natural inspiration and technology. Now that was me saying interdisciplinarity many times over. So I'll hand it over to you, Bianca.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you everybody for being here and for the invitation. I'm very honored. And yeah, I'm based in Zurich. And as Mary Ellen said, I will briefly speak about what I'm researching currently and why is this connection that we are trying to build with Jonathon and the River Time Initiative. So for 1 second, I will share my screen with all of you. And just to show you a couple of slides, this is the context in which I'm working currently. And I am, as I said, based at the Transdisciplinarity Lab here at ETH Zurich, but specifically I'm working in a European project funded by the European Commission that is called SHAPE ID. That's acronym for Shaping Interdisciplinary Practices. So basically what we are doing is we are investigating how these difficult words, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, to which I will come back in 1 second, are being done in Europe, and why are these important for addressing societal challenges or the current crisis that we are facing. So I was trained, as Mary Ellen said, as an anthropologist. And from the very beginning, I was very interested in how collaborative research is being done, what it implies, why it is important, and what are their assets, what other aims and goals we can achieve when we work together with others. And that's why I got into these two difficult words that are the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary realms. And this, from a very simplistic perspective, this imply working with others, especially with other disciplines, if we think about interdisciplinarity, and especially with other actors, other people, whoever those are, if we are working in a transdisciplinary environment. But as I said, so these are collaborative means. These are just two. There are many others and many ways of defining these terms that I will not come back. I will not focus on this today. But what I did like from the very beginning was I was very motivated to think of this idea of co-production. So when you work in inter-transdisciplinarity, you are co-producing something. You are putting two things together because you are doing this with others. So the co here stands for that, for working with others. And then there's the production, or it's even the creation. You can also co-create with others. So for me and for the colleagues that are working, or I am working together with at this European project, Shape ID, I think the important thing here is not only the co and the produce, the co and the create, but what happens in the middle. So I will focus on the dash, on the hyphen, on this link between these two words. Because for me, there's what the interesting thing of collaboration happens. There is where we are focusing our attention in our research, because we want to have more artists and more people coming from the humanities participating in this process. And that's what we call, some of us, in-between spaces. So these are the spaces where we collaborate. And what happens here? Well, mainly it happens a lot of things, and mainly there's a process of negotiation. There's a process of mutual learning. There's a process of trying to see how controversies, conflicts, and how can we build some of these new perspectives that Jonathon was speaking about. So that is why one of the reasons that I was very interested in the River Time initiative, because in our project, and as Jonathon has already said, we are looking forward to methods and tools that also give us the possibility of researching, but of also integrating new insights and new ways of understanding research. Not only trying to, as I said at the beginning, approach societal challenges, but also trying to integrate new ways of sensing, of perceiving nature and society. And this has to do mainly with, as Mary Ellen was nicely introducing myself, with this idea that the way we live and we interact and we enact in our social world, in our everyday world, and also in nature, is the way in which we can also research these settings, and we could also co-produce or co-create knowledge together. So this is to say that that's why I think that's so important to open these new spaces, these in-between spaces, to experiment with arts and humanities in ways that maybe they were forgotten or left aside, and do it collectively, as Jonathon was suggesting and inviting us to do it. I think it has a better way of sensing what is happening around us. So I will not take more time, but I'm very happy to receive questions. So I'll stop sharing, and I will give the floor to my colleague here, Stephanie Vasco.
So as Mary Ellen said in my introduction, I currently work as the managing director for the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity. And at MSU C4I, as we call ourselves, we focus on 3 areas with the idea of building community. We look at enhancing grants, leading research, and empowering graduates. And if you're more interested in C4I, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we have a website. Please feel free to visit all of those or send me an email afterward. But I want to talk about all 3 of these today. We're going to talk a little bit about grants and graduates as collaborative programs, and then I'm going to talk about my own research in the art science world. So in terms of graduate education, we run a transdisciplinary graduate fellowship program through C4I. It runs 9 months, usually, or 8 months, January through August or September, depending on how students want to finish their projects up. Since we run this program, we are about to start our 3rd year, and we've been working with the Arts Council of Greater Lansing since our inception of this program. So 3 students get to work with the Arts Council of Greater Lansing to co-produce knowledge with them. So to come up with a research question, think about something they want to address, consider deliverables that work for both them and the partner, and get that experience of doing transdisciplinary research in the real world with a real world partner. We also are the home for the Toolbox Dialect Initiative, or TDI. And TDI facilitates collaboration and communication for a lot of teams. We've been National Science Foundation funded, but we also facilitate collaboration with art science teams. So one of the groups we've been working with for the past few years has been the Living Architecture Systems group based in Canada. In my own research, I think that I live in that in-between space Bianca was just talking about. I have a PhD in chemistry and nanotechnology where I focused on designing semiconductor nanostructures using atomic force microscopy. So I'm very interested in surfaces. I'm interested in surface transformations, but I also bring those other parts of my life to the creation of artistic work. Specifically, I'm from Northwest New Jersey. I grew up near the Appalachian Trail, near the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. And the contested history of that area has really been something that has inspired a lot of the artistic practice I do. So this piece, Rock Course, Tox Island, looks at the proposed Tox Island Dam. So there's a bit of a topological map in the back there, and shows the only thing that ever got built in the very long history of creating this park and trying to build a dam there, which are the rock core samples that show that it wouldn't be viable to build a dam there. I'm interested in ways that art and science can come together and give you that moment of pause or creation, or make you think, how did someone do that? How is that done? So thinking about creating surface glazes that look like metals, that bring the natural and ceramic and metallic world together, thinking about that intersection of human and man-made versus the natural world. So this is a piece that kind of looks at trying to think about how nature and the man-made world come together and mimicking those surfaces and thinking about kind of senses of play and senses of surface. Since COVID-19 has been kind of ravaging our world around us, it also has had a really deep and profound impact on my artistic practice. One of the things that I took from our fellowship students this year was the idea of slow work and thinking about kind of slowing the process down, reflecting. And so this piece, Dinner Theater, is a combo watercolor and embroidery piece that the genesis of this was just like sitting outside, taking a moment, having some takeout dinner, and watching a dragonfly as it meandered across and around the river, and just thinking about the paths they take and the time and ways that they move. And how do you create that? How do you use different textures? How do you use different tools when you're slowing down, but thinking about the time evolution of something? This year, I'm extremely excited to say that I have an immersive installation at Science Gallery Detroit, which has been in the Future Present show that opened in September and runs through December if you're interested in seeing it in person. If you are interested in seeing it online, there's a great website. But I've had to adapt a lot of the pieces of this immersive installation to the idea that COVID has changed the way that we can have actual installations. It changes the way that we can experience the world. And it made me think also about the idea of accessibility and climate change, the tools we use to create art, and the ways in which we share things. So this piece shows a Snapchat lens that I created using an image of bark from a birch tree. and then bringing that bark surface into all of your floors in your home. So paper birch is available to anyone. You can go to Snapchat and get it as a lens, and then take images of you turning your floor into birch bark. So thinking about, right, it's not that birch tree that's out in nature by itself. It's now, you can bring it into your home, experience it and play with it, and think about what it might be like to see that in nature. But what might it be like if you don't ever get to, or if that tree becomes extinct because of climate change, or it's no longer native to a place? This piece, Bark Evolution, is generated using machine learning and a set of images I took of bark up in Nordhaus Dunes, the same place that the bark image from the previous piece was taken, before putting into the Snapchat. Snapchat has a very good developer studio, and they have a machine learning lens that you can build on top. So that's how that previous piece was created. This one was created using a set of images that I had taken, and then putting them into Runway ML, and then using that to generate images of bark. So this piece is a little bit playful, and we're asking participants who go through Immersive Forest to try and figure out which of these bark images are the ones that are computer generated and which are the ones that are real. So thinking about that sense of time, what would it look like to just be a Michigan tree? What does it look like when we mash up those barks? Can you distinguish between what's computer generated and what's human generated? So thinking really about the ways that we approach climate change, accessibility, trying out new tools, because this is a space and a time that we have for that. And these tools are available to individuals to be creative and to think about that and to do that sense of play. So I'm, in a lot of my practice, trying to inspire people to maybe make their own creations or try something new, paint with a new paintbrush. For me, that's been GPT-2 and Runway ML and Snapchat, things that I hadn't explored before COVID kind of ruined the fact that I used to work out of community studios to be a ceramicist and a blacksmith. So it's really forced me to focus on new methods, new ways of being interdisciplinary, and new ways of thinking about the ways in which all have access to nature and think about climate change.
Great, thank you so much, Bianca and Stephanie, for your information you shared about your work. We're going to move now to a group discussion, but I wanted to ask the two of you first if you could say something about the similarities and differences between European and US universities who work around interdisciplinarity. Do you have a sense of how that is similar or different? And I'm curious about how your departments or centers measure the impact of working with interdisciplinary collaborations in art and science. How do you measure the value and impact of that? Maybe, you know, at your universities, at your departments, but maybe also as an artist, and you know, that this could apply to a museum as well.
Thanks, Mary Ellen, for the question. Yes, inter and transdisciplinarity are not new at all, and there are some differences between Europe or European countries and what the US has been doing. But I mean, the US has a very long tradition of interdisciplinary research that I'm sure Stephanie can give a lot of details about. I think that those differences are quite interesting in terms sometimes of methods and even in ways of understanding collaborative research, but there are many right now encounters and common points, I mean, common topics, because the inter and transdisciplinary community, I think it's getting more and more strong in the last few decades. And fortunately, this has also led to a lot of work and collaboration between people from the US, or scholars and senior researchers from the US, professors, and those from European countries. I don't think there are like so big differences. On the contrary, I think that there's there are several networks that are currently working together. And in terms of impact, specifically what we are currently researching is that, because there's a gap, there's a lack in how arts and humanities work and participate in this type of collaborative research. So they are there, they have contributed a lot and in the past, but sometimes it's very difficult to really grasp their contribution because they're simply because they are there, but they are not giving like a leading position, or they are not giving the right space to develop their own research questions or shared research questions from a more artistic perspective, maybe. So I think that there are different ways to measure that impact. But from my perspective, what is very important is really to think and to leverage that contribution, to make it visible, and in this sense, I think that's the nice connection with the River Time Initiative, to find out how these dialogues with the arts can really improve the way we do science and we do research, in terms of we can also rethink what research is and how we position ourselves when researching.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I'm always excited when I get to hang out with my European colleagues at conferences, because there is a little bit of a difference between the European and American ways of practicing. One of the things that I'm always envious about as an American is there's been a longer history of grants in Europe for transdisciplinary work that focus on working with the community. And that's an exciting thing that I think we're seeing a little bit more of a trend to in the US. That's something that our transdisciplinary grad fellowship gets a bit at as well. And it's always inspiring to hear about the different kinds of projects, right? Because like Bianca was saying, some of the foci in the US are a little bit different than the foci in Europe, and we get together and we think about ways in which we can bridge that. So T4I is excited to do a little more international work. We're excited that Bianca's going to join us in January, February for a lecture and a masterclass coming up. But thinking about measuring impact is difficult inside the academia, because it leads to a conversation about retention, promotion, and tenure, and how those things get valued by scholars and how those things get valued by the leadership, and what the change has to be around promotion and tenure criteria. So that's an area in which our center is actively working and doing things like hosting workshops, working with individuals, working with the leadership, trying to reconceptualize what it looks like to be a researcher in 2020 and beyond, who is working in those dialogues. Because like Bianca stated, it's important to be having those dialogues, and those dialogues are going to be driving the future of research. It's those connections where artists are learning from scientists, taking some of their tools. Scientists are learning from artists, taking some of their tools. We're coming together and we're finding new ways to create and innovate because we've come together in this integrative, transdisciplinary way. For myself, measuring the impact of it, I love it if someone sends me a message that they thought a piece was cool, or a piece inspired them, or they're thinking about something another way. If I see someone using that Snapchat lens and they're just like having fun and engaging with it, and there's that sense of play, then for me, that's a win.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think we'll bring in Jonathan and Julie to the conversation. Jonathan, I'm curious about the next steps for River Time in Switzerland, how you'll develop there. What are your plans for this next step? And also how you're going to work with Bianca at ETH. What will that look like?
Well, River Time has, from the outset, really been global in terms of its concerns. And therefore, from the outset, the idea has been to create nested systems which ultimately come about through making River Time manifest in different places according to ground conditions and according to different opportunities that there might be in one place versus in another. So partly what we've been able to achieve in Alaska, in addition to being able to start a thought experiment that will continue over the long term, is that we've come up with tools that can be applied elsewhere in terms of how the clock that we're using in Alaska is calibrated by US Geological Survey gauging stations, which are approximately equivalent to those in Switzerland, for instance, and throughout Europe. So in a sense, what we've been doing is prototyping a system that can then be applied elsewhere. And a large part of the conversation with Bianca really has been to figure out, how do we take what we've already developed and how do we apply it effectively in another place? But how do we also think about that other place in terms of where new meaning might accrue as a result of the nature of rivers and also the nature of society in that other place? So in terms of looking to Switzerland, I think that one of the real ambitions is to look at the tradition of clock and watchmaking that is, again, a cliche, but again, it tells us something. So in the case of Alaska River Time, what we've been able to do is to create a digital system, which I suppose is appropriate in a way, given that I'm just up the road from Silicon Valley, though it wasn't intended to be that. And in fact, all of our technical development comes courtesy of Craig Suchland, who has been working at the Anchorage Museum as head of IT and also has incredible abilities, as it turns out, as a computer programmer. We've been able to develop something that is possible to use in ways that we've already done. So currently we are moving from a strictly online manifestation of River Time to one that is a projection, a municipal clock in Anchorage, projecting that onto the facade of the museum. But in Switzerland, there is incredible know-how around electromechanics, around clockmaking, that can potentially lead to a permanent municipal clock on the ground in Zurich, in Bellinzona, in Bern, in all the various places that are fluvial in terms of the fact that these are cities that were formed on or near rivers. I think that another aspect of it really is going to be to look at this as a transdisciplinary effort in a way that was not the emphasis in Anchorage, where it was a museum-led project with a grant from the Bloomberg Foundation that was very much oriented toward trying to connect with community, which is and remains really important, but where there was not the feedback mechanism or the sort of dialogue that comes about when you have someone in academia who is looking at transdisciplinarity as a phenomenon and looking at art science collaboration as a phenomenon and effectively doing anthropology in the process of the making of and deployment of a project. And that's really what we're looking at here, because Bianca has that background and expertise, and her perspective is going to be essential to be able to be in dialogue with an anthropologist, to be able to calibrate the project to people's lives in Switzerland, where Bianca, as an anthropologist, can observe what people are doing and how they're interacting with it, and that can inform what it becomes. This is extremely exciting, and ultimately, I think as we move across Europe and also as we start to look at Asia, as we start to look everywhere, every continent, I suppose probably not Antarctica at this point, but all the others, it will be, I think, with that anthropological perspective, in addition to the technical abilities that we've already developed, in addition to some of the new experiments that we can try out, new modes of interaction, it can become something more. We've already, for instance, had concerts that are calibrated on river time that have been achieved in Anchorage. But I think that there are other sorts of interactions with it that are particular to any given place. And that will be a large part of what we're looking at as we move forward.
Mhm. Great, thanks. I think we'll turn to, we have a couple of questions in our Q&A. There's so many questions I have for all of you. It's difficult with only having a few minutes left. We have a question from Aaron, who asks about where he could get more information on how the time is actually calculated. There's also a question from Charlotte about how, asking for a brief introduction of what the rivers are doing. So these are quite specific questions for you, Jonathan. I'm wondering if you could address those.
Sure. The first question can be answered with a URL. So www.alaskarivertime.org. If you go to the About section, there is a detailed explanation. But conceptually, which is where I work, the easiest way to think about it would be that you take a water wheel, you place it in a river. The size of the water wheel is determined based on that wheel spinning at 1 revolution per minute. You then use clockwork connecting that wheel to a second wheel that gives you minutes, a third that gives you hours, and ultimately to a perpetual calendar that is able to keep count over the years. And then you stand back and you give the river authority to let you know what time it is. And as the river flows more quickly or more slowly, that water wheel will turn more quickly or more slowly. Or in other words, your river time, seconds, minutes, and hours will be more rapid or will be slower in relation to the time kept by an atomic clock. And your perpetual calendar will keep count that might get ahead of or might get behind the Gregorian calendar. If you put a water wheel into a river in Alaska, forget about it. It's not going to last very long, and the salmon aren't going to be very happy either. So we're not doing that. We're using instead other means that are not developed by me, happily, because that would be, again, a case in which it would probably work for about an hour at most. We're instead using technologies that the US Geological Survey has developed that are based on, I believe, in many cases, optical or piezoelectric systems that are able to measure river flow with a high degree of scientific accuracy. And really, I think what this comes down to is this sort of art-science collaboration at many different levels. But one level is ultimately a technical level. That is to say that this concept of a water wheel in the river can then connect with scientific observation that is already happening, because it's really important to measure flow of rivers for a lot of other reasons as well. So that infrastructure has already been in place in Alaska, and also is the case in Switzerland. But we're basically taking that phenomenon of flow, which could be measured by any number of different means, and allowing the fluctuation in flow to determine the fluctuation in terms of rate of time, the rate at which time is passing.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes left. If there are any more questions from the audience, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I have a question for all of you, really, but I'm wondering how important is climate change, that burning issue, to all of you through your practice, through your institutions. And Julie, you mentioned that this is accelerated in Alaska. How important is this question for interdisciplinary projects? Maybe Julie, could you say something about what kind of impacts you want towards impacting and helping people understand climate change? How important is that to your museum?
I will say it's central to our museum. We've been transdisciplinary since our founding. So while we talk about art history and science and culture, really what we're talking about is place and how people interact with the environment of that place. In Alaska, it's an extreme environment, and the impacts of climate change are also extreme. Obviously, climate change impacts vulnerable communities first, and that's a major issue in thinking about our traditional and indigenous lifeways. Indigenous knowledge is key to understanding our future with climate change. And so for us, it was, how do you move people from a misunderstanding of deep time or a lack of connection to the deep time aspects of climate change, which feels abstract. How do we move people in the rest of the globe away from thinking about our place as only a melting ice cap and think about human life ways, and how in urban places can we understand climate change as something that impacts us every day in our food and in our transportation and in the way we live. So for us, centering this conversation around rivers and reconnecting with nature, or connecting with nature, seeing the timekeepers around us was a way of making climate change tangible. It's something everybody can access, everybody can think about, everybody can look at their atomic clock or the river clock and think about our impact on the place and the natural world around us. So it's central to how we think. We're thrilled to work with Jonathon on taking this lens into examining not just what's happening now, but how we contemplate our future.
Thank you. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, so maybe I'll just ask each of you if you have any sort of last words or takeaways you'd like the audience to think about or consider. Should I start with you, Jonathon?
I hope that everybody who is participating in this conversation and listening in on it will take this as an invitation, a strong suggestion to observe any and all natural phenomena around all of us. We are a part of nature. We need to reintegrate with nature in every way if we're to survive and to survive with others, with other people and other species. And I think that we can have mechanisms that can help us, such as a clock that's calibrated by a river, but ultimately we can do this most effectively, I think, by living in the world and being sensitive to change and allowing that to affect how we live and the decisions that we make.
Thank you. Guess I'll ask you now, Bianca. Any last thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Mary Ellen. Yeah, for me, I think that there are one or two messages I take with me. Again, that's the idea that how powerful we are when we work or we think collectively. And I like, again, the idea of the river time, because it gives us the possibility of rethinking how we position ourselves in nature and society. So I think that's one of a reflective exercise that it's useful even in our daily surrounding. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie and Stephanie, are there any last thoughts? Maybe Julie on your side.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to say, going back to your previous question too, Mary Ellen, climate change plays such an important role in the way that I'm thinking about future research projects with C4I and with the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative and in my own art, because it's bringing that evolution of what's happening out there into people's lives is one of the most important inspirations for me, but also drivers for some of the art that I've been making. Is how do we take what's going on in the world and make it more accessible to individuals? How do we take it and make it more immersive? How do we take climate change from something that might not be a part of your everyday, or you might not think about, to something that you can tangibly have some experience of, that you can touch, that you can see, that you can experience, and kind of getting into that experience in a way that makes you think more about it and think more about your role. And the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach is going to be one of the most important keys I think we have, is taking the inspiration and knowledge from others, bringing those together to find both innovative solutions to climate change and ways to educate and inspire around climate change as well.
Thank you, Julie.
I just want to thank everybody for this conversation. We look forward to connecting to Switzerland around river time.
Great. And I also thank all of you today, all the speakers, the audience. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I can't wait to see what happens next with River Time and with everyone and your work. Good luck, congratulations, and thank you.
Thank you.